In 1901, New York kept a file it could not close. Inside, it lived a man who appeared twice. Once in the roll book, where his name was inked in a hand that seemed certain, and again in a photograph where the emulsion refused certainty, producing two faces on one body. One turned to the lamp, the other lodged in shadow, neither admitting the other's end. The first physician to write his case did not call it miraculous. He called it incompatible. His line was brief, underlined, heavy at the end, not aligned. The second physician called it a distortion, a failure of glass or eye. The third made no note at all, but he filed the photograph, and beside it the empty. Space meant for a diagnosis. They said his first face lived. They said his second face did not. Yet both watched. One through open lids, one through closed skin that seemed stitched, yet breathing. The nurses said the second mouth moved, but not to speak. The attendants swore they saw the lips tighten. As though about to form a word, the clerks wrote nothing. Clerks rarely do. The paradox began not in the flesh, but in the ledger. A man cannot be filed twice under one number. Yet the ward census insists on it. Bed assigned, profile unassigned. Age confirmed, not time. One face was catalogued. The other remained margin. The ledger wanted singularity. The body refused. This is where our descent begins. Not in the spectacle of flesh, but in the quiet insistence of paper that reality be. One thing, when it is 2. Tonight, we open the drawer, sit with the record, and follow the contradictions as they bloom. We will not rush. We will not simplify. We will let each page breathe as it did when it first left the clerk's hand, when the ink was still wet, when the silence was still a choice. If you are new here, consider joining. Not as an audience, but as a witness. These files are long, and they resist being carried alone. Subscribe if you haven't yet, but think of it less as a button, more as taking a seat at the table where we lay these pages out. And if you're already listening, tell me your country and the time. There's a comfort in knowing that while the case itself refused to close, we remain scattered yet gathered, hearing the same story at the same moment. The man was written in newspapers too. Some papers called him a fraud, a carniac for a fairground. Others called him a medical anomaly, a new frontier for surgery. But the official hospital register, Ward D, line 14, calls him nothing at all. It carries his name, his date, his bed. Then an empty slot, a refusal to conclude. That refusal is the true beginning of our file. Folklore already knew this shape. The changeling, left by unknown hands, whose body carries more than one presence. The revenant who returns not as himself, but as a doubled shadow, half alive, half. Recited, the automaton, built by hidden years, whose eyes blink in a sequence not their own. We will not confuse these with fact, but we note them because myth often remembers what clerks deny. There is a photograph. Cabinet card, matte finish, studio emboss at the corner. His head turned just enough for both profiles to emerge. One clean, one parasitic, yet neither fading. With time, under UV light, the control photo darkens and fades. His does not. It returns unchanged. The technician would not write impossible. He wrote instead, image not aligned. The paradox hurts to hear. A man lived, but he also carried a face. That doctors refused to classify. They tried silence, erasure, renaming. They called it growth. They called it fraud. They called it irrelevant. But they could not call it gone. In New York, in 1901, a man lived with two faces. One the doctors named, the other they hid. The paper insists on a period. The body insists on a comma. The ledger wants to close. The drawer whispers otherwise. Don't close the file. The file rests in a drawer that resists its rails. Brass handle worn by too many pulls. oak corners polished not, by care but by repetition. A desk that holds it carries its own scars, grooves where clerks pressed their wrists, a ring of ink that once dripped from a pen left uncapped, a shadow in the wood where a lamp sat so long its absence is now a mark. We imagine the room. In 1901, gaslight burning too low, the air thick with coal soot drifting from the street. The walls are not painted white, but a yellowed gray, the color of paper that has been handled too often. There is a smell of damp wool, carried in by overcoats hung too near to heat. And always the sound, the distant hiss of steam pipes, the scratch of nib on paper, the drawer sliding open and shut like a breath too, often repeated. Here the man with two faces becomes less a body and more a dossier. Line 14. Ward D. The census card lists him as present. Male, age 34. Then a gap, a space meant for notes that instead holds only a dash. A refusal, a hesitation. Clerks sometimes used shorthand to say more than they could admit. A dash can mean absence, or it can mean more than absence, a presence they dare not name. The placard on the wall lists the patients by number, not by name. His number is struck through once, then written again, as though the chalk hesitated. Not compatible, not aligned, not assigned. The refrain mutates in silence, even when it is not spoken. At the edge of the room, a calendar still hangs to March. Though the case entered in May, no one corrected it. No one dared. Time itself, in this room, lagged behind, unwilling to mark his presence as ordinary. If you place your hand on the desk, even now, you feel the smooth groove where another hand always rested, as though the furniture remembered more than the men who worked at it. The room keeps count, even when the register refuses, and it is here, among dust and silence, that the second face intrudes. Not in flesh, for the body was confined to a bed. Elsewhere, but in paper. The photograph was kept in this drawer, folded between census slips and receipts for coal deliveries. Imagine the drawer being opened, a clerk pulling the card, the image sliding half into lamplight. The first profile looks ordinary, jawline, brow, the anatomy of any man on the ward. The second profile, conjoined, fused, unresolved, catches the clerk's eye. He pauses. He underlines the ledger. He files it back. Folklore lingers even here. The Irish clerk's new stories of the changeling child, left in the cradle, its face wrong, its cries unearthly. The Italian attendants whispered. About revenants, those who return with unfinished expressions, half living, half remembered. The Polish nurse crossed herself when she passed the bed. They did not call it science. They called it a shadow that eats its host. The locus is not just a room. It is a system made visible. The placards, the calendars, the chalk lines, all of them testifying not to the man, but to the institution that tried to contain him. Paper is not memory. Paper is creation. And here, creation falters. The desk resists. The drawer whispers. The ledger carries dents where no ink was laid. And in that resistance, we feel the story press outward. The city outside may have carried on with trolleys clattering, stock tickers spitting numbers, but inside this ward office, the air thickened around one file that refused closure. This is our locus. A desk too warm, a drawer that breathes when opened, a placard that falters, a calendar that will not turn. Here the man with two faces is not just a patient. He is a paradox that infects the furniture, the chalk, the very act of record-keeping. Record number 1 begins as all obedient records do, with a date, a hand, a certainty that does not deserve the name. May 11th, 1901. Admission roll. Ward. D. The signature belongs to a clerk who signs as Loop Low, a habit you can trace across April, across June, never once broken until this page, where the pressure deepens at the tail, as if the pen chose to finish after the line should have lifted. Name entered. Age entered. Bed number chalked first on the wall, and then copied here -14. The particulars column tries to behave. Occupation, address, parish. Then the note line, the one that allows a human margin. It receives not a diagnosis, not an observation, but a word that the office does not use. Not compatible. Beneath the ink, the paper keeps its own account. Under raking light, a curve appears where no ink sits. A faint graphite ghost, like the memory of a digit that never quite agreed to be born. The curve wants a 2 where the ledger prints a 1. A ghost stroke that turns 14 toward 24, and then refuses to commit. The clerk's hand, or a hand that pressed before ink, left a decision in the fiber. The number the room lived with is not the number the page carried. The bed never moved. The paper tried. On the reverse side, the ward census card repeats the entry in the clipped. Nouns of an office that does not believe in adjectives. Male, 34, laborer, then a slash, through remark and a dash. A small mark that buys silence. A dash can be absence. A dash can also be a refusal that allows the room to go on pretending a decision has been made. Later, someone adds a second dash at right angles to the first, as if to pin the emptiness. Down. The first contradiction hides where contradictions like to hide, not in the headline line, but in the copied line, the place where routine is supposed to stabilize intention. The nurse's night log for May 12th reads, respiration even, face presented, left, second profile in repose. The office does not have a code for that. The log carries no code at all. It is written in the obstinate grammar of experience. Presented left, second profile in repose. You can hear the nurse reaching for words that will be allowed to live in the book without being struck by a superior's pencil. She avoids calling it a face. She calls it a pose. Even while she measures breath in neat counts of 12 to the minute, even while she writes temperature 98, skin cold, not clammy, she sneaks the impossible past the border guards of bureaucratic speech. Second profile in repose. The physician's first note sits 2 pages later and tries to erase that effort with a word smaller than the phenomenon. Growth. The ink on growth is darker than the rest of the line, as though the nib lingered there. To make sure the word outsang the room, he underlines it once, and the underline cuts a shallow furrow into the stock. Beneath that furrow, the lampblack finds a second movement, a minor curve lifting toward a second line, the beginning of a cone. Second underline that someone restrained. The page remembers what the hand wanted to insist upon, and then didn't. Growth, not aligned. A coroner's receipt slips into the folder for reasons the file does not explain. It belongs to a different process, stamped with the county seal, and a time device whose 2 carries a tiny chip that leaves a missing fleck on every impression. Every document in May bears that chip, a small absence in the belly of the 2. Every document except one, a photograph accession label for our man's plate. The impression reads 12:40 p.m., May 13th, 1901, the 2 whole, the belly intact. Either the stamp forgot its chip for a single press, or the label remembers a time before the chip existed. The office would never call it anachronism. The office calls nothing that might demand the room be asked a question. Still, the label sits there, belly of the 2 intact, and around it the month continues to print the chip like a stutter the stamp cannot avoid. The physician returns to prose that feels safe, lesion suspected. There is comfort in Latin that names, without seeing. He measures circumference in inches and eighths, writes 8/3/8 along the margin, but then, next to that measurement, an erasure smear where graphite once wrote 9 and the hand changed its mind. Numbers that move get questioned. Numbers that move get priced. Numbers that move get punished. Numbers that hold get paid. He lets 8 3/8 remain, because 8 3/8 does not move. There is a testimonial from a visiting surgeon, who writes with the airy confidence of the metropolitan press. He calls it a textbook case of diprosopis, then adds a sentence that does not survive his own flourish. No ocular motility observed in the accessory. The nurse, reading this later, copies her log again in her tight script and adds 3 words. The office does not use. He blinks in order. She has counted. First the primary eyelid, then a second tension beneath the skin where the accessory eye should not be. She does not write blinks twice, because that would be a claim. She writes in order, which is an observation of sequence, not existence. The page lets that pass. Procedure loves a sequence. We are expected, by the rhythm of such files, to find a diagnosis or a transfer, something that moves the story along. Instead, we get the first transfer memo, then its denial. Transfer to surgical observation signed, and then struck. A graphite X over the signature, and beside it a single word in block letters, unassigned. The office rarely writes refusal as a noun. Here it does. Unassigned is a category that keeps the body where the paper can forget it. Unassigned lets the ledger be complete without admitting what it holds. A city inspector signs off the ward minutes on May 20th and writes nothing. Of the man. He lists bed counts, sheets laundered, lamps refilled, the simple math of a building's breathing. But the count of beds includes 24, while the ward card insists the numbered beds end at 22. Meal chits for the week match 24 trays, the chalk placard. Last turn to March still shows 22. There is a small arithmetic that happens when a presence refuses category. The room begins to accept the number. The file will not. The nurse writes an asterisk next to the meal count and adds in small letters, 2 trays to bed 14. No one circles it. The arithmetic remains an open parenthesis. The first witness deposition is not a deposition at all, but a donated Bible, with a cocked spine and a mishelved ribbon. Inside the front leaf, a child's hand has written, with the bravado of an uncorrected pencil, 2 faces, and below it, a date that does not match the admission, April 29th. If you press that leaf against the light, you see 3 dents where a heavier hand wrote beneath the child's line. Not kept, not kept, still recorded. The church is not the ward, but the ward uses the church for names, for burying, for those parts of paperwork the hospital hates to own. The inscription returns the refrain the office will not write, not allowed. To end dot by now, the first record has shown us what the first record always shows us when it is honest. The contradiction lives in the margins, the numbers, the pressures, the stamps that do not agree with their own bodies. A photograph sits between documents that speak as if it does not. Its accession label remembers a slug before the slug chipped. The nurse measures a blink where an eye is not permitted. The physician measures inches and hides the 9th. The desk itself, where the record rests, gives back a ring where a lamp stood all day, and within that ring, a faint wine-colored stain. It repeats the shape of the circular hospital seal, as if the wood drank ink until it could reproduce authority by memory alone. The record brings us one more small device that looks like certainty and behaves like doubt. The ward's morning list, torn from its perforation, carries at the bottom a printed line, observations to be completed before noon. Next to our man's entry, a rubber stamp repeats a phrase used for equipment, not for human beings. Hold until observation. The letters sit a little proud, less absorbed by the page than the surrounding ink. A physical superimposition, as if the machine's instruction has been laid on flesh and hopes to make flesh obey. Hold until observation becomes a spell because it is repeated. It appears again on the shelf tag where his photograph rests, again on a requisition for fresh sheets for bed 14, again on a memo that asks whether the case shall be described for the donor's newsletter. Hold until observation. A person is held, and the observation never completes, and the holding becomes the end. The last line of the first record reads, as if it were done by a hand that had already left the room. Temperature 98.2. Skin cold, not clammy. Pulse regular. Appetite reduced. The kind of closing that lets a clerk put the pen down without taking responsibility for what the file has become. But the paper will not grant the period its authority. Under the final dot, a very small dent, a hollow where the nib paused longer than the ink can remember, forms the beginning of a second dot, like a colon waiting for a clause the office declines to write. A file invites continuation. The hand refuses. The page keeps the invitation anyway. We are not meant to solve it here. We are meant to see what the first record already knows. Paper is not memory, it is creation. And when creation meets what it cannot domesticate, it behaves like folklore. It invents refrains. It shifts names, not compatible, not aligned, not assigned. It changes numbers by pressure when ink won't confess. It files a photograph that returns to itself under light and tells the technician to write image unchanged, which he does because he cannot write impossible and keep his job dot. So the first record ends as all honest first records end, not with certainty, but with a place to stand. A bed number that wants to be two numbers. A meal count it feeds a presence the ledger pretends to starve. A stamp that remembers a time before the chip it carries. A nurse who counts blinks in order and writes sequence because sequence is permitted. A drawer that breathes when it closes. Don't close the file, the desk says in its own way, and the record, obedient in everything else, disobeys where it matters, leaving just enough dent for the next page to find dot. Then we move deeper. The second. Record enters not as a ledger, but as a diary. A book with a cloth spine, initials faint on the cover, M.R., 1901. The matron's hand, her loops precise but hurried, her words kept short to pass as duty, but long enough to betray feeling. She writes of linens, of broth prepared thin, of a ward too warm for sleep. And then, among the routine, one line that the physicians never copied. The quiet one watches in my place dot. She does not name him. She does not have to. She knows the ledger, forbids it. But she records her own contradiction. A second presence, silent, watching. The handwriting leans to the right, ink pooling at the tail of watches, as though she pressed harder to insist it had happened. The page allows it because it is private, but the moment it is copied into official speech, it becomes an error to be struck. Beside the diary, another voice. Elijah Rowe, attendant. Deposition taken months later when a donor asked whether the case was real or staged. His testimony reads like verse, line after line with no punctuation. He lies still. He lies facing left the other. Lies right. I did not speak to it. I will not. The clerk who transcribed this deposition tried to force order by inserting commas, but the rhythm survives, the refusal to end sentences where sentences should end. Elijah repeats the word lies 5 times in 12 lines, as if the double presence made truth itself fracture. And there is yet another voice, stitched from outside the ward. A neighbor's condolence letter, dated June 1901, addressed to the family of another patient. In its margin, a note in different ink. The quiet one walks your garden row at night. Folklore hides in condolence. Neighbors do not invent. They repeat. They shape what they see into superstition, because superstition is safer than diagnosis. Together, these fragments confirm what the ledger resists. The second face was witnessed, was described, was feared. And yet the official record continues its refusal. Growth, lesion, unassigned. Always language that closes, never language that opens. The contradictions sharpen in detail. Miriam's diary records that his left eye closed at dusk, his right remaining open. Elijah's deposition says the opposite, that the left remained open, the right closed. But both agree on the impossible sequence. One eye sleeps while the other keeps watch. The office cannot catalog half-sleep. It has no column for that. So the phenomenon exists only in the forbidden speech of witnesses, the spaces where procedure cannot reach. Silence becomes its own defense. The matron never confronts the physicians. She writes in her diary instead. Elijah refuses questions with repetition. I will not. The neighbor wraps her fear in metaphor. Each of them finds a way to record while avoiding the punishment of being struck from the file. Silence is not absence. Silence is survival. Even so, silence leaks into the documents themselves. The ward minutes for June 10th list meals, temperatures, and sheets. At the bottom, where a physician's note should conclude the session there, is a half line abandoned, not meant no ink follows. Just a dash, drawn long, and cut short as though the hand was removed mid-sentence. Paper remembers hesitation more faithfully than certainty. What myth speaks here? In some traditions, the second face is called the mask that eats. It consumes the host, borrowing breath without giving voice. In others, it is the watcher, a spirit attached to the body to guard or punish. And still others call it the unasked witness, an eye left open so nothing can be forgotten. None of these myths name our man, yet all of them echo his file. The contradictions. Multiply, the matron sees the second mouth move. Elijah swears it never does. The neighbor claims the figure walked her garden, though the ward kept its doors locked. The inspector's report claims nothing at all, yet his count of trays shows more mouths than beds. Which witness is true? The answer is not one but all. Contradiction itself becomes the truest record. By July, the refrain is mutated again. The matron writes, not allowed to end. Elijah writes, still on file. The neighbor simply underlines her own words, pressing the ink twice into the paper, as if to make sure someone, someday, would see. Each phrase a survival, each mutation an incantation. Second record confirms the first not by agreement, but by echo. One says the face blinked. Another says it didn't. Both insist a second presence existed. One says silence, one says movement. Both record what the office cannot, that the man was never singular. The institution thrives on singularity. One bed, one name, one diagnosis. To admit otherwise would fracture the very system that pays for order. So the ledger continues to write one, while the witnesses continue to write two. The file becomes a battlefield where silence fights testimony, where myth fights paper, and still the residue grows. The matron's diary ends in August with a line that reads, "It has learned my hours." Elijah's deposition ends with refusal. "I will not speak more." The neighbor's letter is folded into the file, though it has no business there, and carries its marginal ghost. The quiet one walks. 3 witnesses, 3 contradictions, none of them erased. The file carries them forward, even as the official. Lying remains unchanged. Growth, lesion, unassigned. The system refuses to speak what the witnesses insist, but it cannot erase them either. So it files both silence and contradiction, side by side. This is the second record. It does not replace the first. It confirms it by disobedience, by surviving where erasure was intended. The photograph arrives in our hands with the weight of proof. Cabinet card, matte surface, embossed with the studio's name. H. Granger and Sons, New York, 1901. The card should have yellowed. The edges should have silvered, a halo creeping outward as time chews at emulsion. Instead, it lies still, the whites stubbornly white, the blacks bottomless, As if it has learned to hold its own breath. In the laboratory notes, a technician writes with clinical restraint. Control fades. Subject returns. His meaning is simple, but the effect is not. They placed the photograph under ultraviolet light, a procedure meant to coax age out of hiding, to reveal the slow damage of decades. The control sample, another card from the same studio, fogged and dulled, as any image should. But our man's photograph did not age. It darkened like weather building in the sky, then it lightened again, returning to its original balance. Image unchanged. Technicians are trained not to write words like impossible. They borrow the vocabulary of alignment, of comparison, of deviation within limits. Not aligned, one note reads. Not responsive, another. They do not admit anomaly. They circle it with bureaucratic language. But the truth leaks through in the rhythm of their sentences. This photograph will not conform. We look closer. The primary face, lit from the left, shows pores, hairs, the ordinary detail of flesh rendered in silver salts. The second face, fused, to the right should appear blurred, a mass of tissue. Yet under magnification, it too resolves, a fold that resembles eyelid, a line like lip. The more we magnify, the less it dissolves. Instead, the fibers insist. This is not blur. This is structure. The emulsion's grain tells another story. Control photographs show random scatter. This one shows recurrence. Patterns repeat as though. The image rehearses itself each time it is viewed. One corner darkens, then returns. A line along the jaw fades, then sharpens. The photograph behaves less like a static record and more like a performance. The report describes this in weather. Turns, perhaps unconsciously. Image clouds, then clears. Image gathers, then lifts. As if the photograph has its own seasons, its own pulse. Other tests follow. A reagent meant to detect iron in ink is brushed across the accession label. The expected result is brown. Instead, the liquid flashes blue, then red, then settles clear. The margin notes read simply, not iron gall. But what does that mean? If not iron, what carrier allowed the label to survive with such brightness? The report refuses to speculate. It files the anomaly and moves on. We return to the photograph because the photograph refuses to release us. The technicians note that the second profile does not respond to light as the first does. When illuminated at an oblique angle, the primary face scatters reflection as expected. The secondary face absorbs. Light goes in, does not return. The paper beneath shows no swelling, no damage. Yet the visual fact remains. One face reflects, the other drinks. Here is where folklore presses against science again. The automaton blinks. In order, the revenant eats the light. The changeling rehearses its shape until the mother despairs. The mythic vocabulary circles the same event the technicians observed, though they will not write the word myth. They write only subject retains. Baseline. The impossibility multiplies when we place the photograph against time. Two prints taken months apart should show difference. But side by side, they do not. Control images from other patients show the subtle drift of hair length, of skin tone, of lighting changes. His remain identical, not similar, but identical, down to the crease in his collar. One print is older, one newer, but they cannot be told apart. It is as though the image itself refused to let time in. One margin note betrays the technician's unease. It rehearses. No further explanation. Just that word, rehearses, as though the photograph were a performer, repeating a role without error, night after night, show after show. And yet the institution files it away. It does not publish. It does not announce. It does not call a second. Opinion from outside. The photograph is filed under not responsive. The test results filed under not iron gall. Silence is safer than astonishment. Still, the residue lingers. If you hold the card under lamplight, you see a faint dent where no ink lies, just pressure in the stock. 3 words, never written, but pressed. Don't close me. Someone, clerk or technician, left that message without committing it to ink. Knowing pressure is harder to erase than writing. The photograph carries not just an image, but an instruction. Here the forensic beat does what the witnesses could not. It refuses denial. Miriam's diary might be dismissed as superstition. Elijah's deposition as fear. A neighbor's margin as gossip. But the photograph, the reagent, the dent, these do not believe. They demonstrate. Science arrives and finds itself muttering in the language of weather, of performance, of refusal. Image unchanged. Not iron gall. Rehearses. Don't close me. This is not a haunting. It is an audit, and the audit fails. Patterns are not accidents in files. They are habits turned into law. And when a phrase repeats across hands, across years, across surfaces not meant to echo one another, we recognize the difference between procedure and incantation. The first refrain was small, almost dismissive, not compatible. A physician's underlined note, written to quiet the anomaly. But silence is never quiet. The words migrate. By July, the ward slip carries a variation, not aligned. Not written by the same hand, not in the same ink, but positioned exactly where the remarks column waits. The hand hesitates on the loop of the G, pressing deeper than necessary, as if to insist the phrase is true by weight alone. Weeks later, a census return to the city health office includes our man in its lines. Age, 34. Sex, race. Remarks, still processing. The phrase belongs not to medicine, but to machinery, to clerks who stamp forms, to packages that wait in stations. Still processing turns a body into an item in a system. Still processing is survival disguised as pause. By September, the refrain appears again, mutated further. A court memo concerning the estate of a patient misfiled into the same folder carries the marginal note, not allowed to end. The words are written in a hurried hand, almost illegible, but legible enough. Someone wrote them in the margin of a property dispute, yet here they live beside the man with 2 faces. The file has absorbed them, or perhaps the file leaks into. Other domains. 3 refrains, 3 mutations, all saying the same truth differently. The case cannot be closed. Patterns do not stop at language. They spread into arithmetic. The meal chit counts, already mismatched in June, begin to settle at 24 trays, even while the official bed list holds at 22. The office does not correct the number. It lets it persist because persistence is easier. An admission. Numbers that move get punished. Numbers that hold get paid. Even the furniture joins. The desk surface, worn smooth where wrists rested, carries scratches faint but legible. Parallel lines, 3 at a time, cut shallow. Someone, clerk or nurse, traced them idly while waiting for ink to dry. 3 lines, then a gap, then 3 more. A rhythm, like breathing, or like blinks counted. He blinks in order. The desk remembers even when the ward forgets. Silence too. Becomes patterned. Elijah Rowe's depositions, copied into a summary, carry his refusal multiplied. I will note repeated in identical phrasing across 3 separate sessions, as though scripted. The matron's diary ends each month with the same unfinished line. It has learned my hours. August, September, October. Always the same. Always left without punctuation. And the photograph, the artifact that refuses to age, insists on its own. Pattern. Each time it is brought under ultraviolet, the same performance unfolds. Clouds, then clears. Darkens, then returns. The notes stack identical, month after month, like weather reports written by a climate that never changes. Folklore recognizes the danger of repetition. Words spoken once are description. Words spoken thrice are spell. In Ireland, the changeling reveals itself when the same nonsense verse is recited 3 nights in a row. In Poland, the revenant's presence is confirmed when 3 witnesses describe the same unease without collusion. In New York, in 1901, the refrain not aligned, still processing, not allowed to end completes its 3rd mutation, and the file becomes less a record than an invocation. We should not exaggerate. These are clerical phrases, born of convenience, not ritual. But convenience can birth ritual when the cost of silence is shared. If every clerk writes a phrase they think safe, soon the phrase takes on its own life. Still processing is easier than naming a face that does not belong. Not aligned is easier than contradicting a surgeon. Not allowed to end is easier than bearing the weight of closure. The system, without deciding, begins to chant. On the ward placard, bed 14 remains struck and re-entered, chalked twice. The repetition survives every cleaning. On the shelf, tag, where the photograph rests, the stamp hold until observation repeats thrice. On the requisition for sheets, the same. On the donor's newsletter draft, the same. Hold until observation. Hold until observation. Hold until observation. Each repetition deepens the echo until it ceases to describe and begins to command. The file is held. The man is held. Observation is promised, never delivered. And yet the observation is always underway. Nurses count blinks. Clerks underline bents. Technicians watch photographs darken and clear. We too observe, across a century, refusing to close the file. The echo tells us something essential about systems. They do not require belief to function. They require repetition. And repetition, once begun, will carry itself forward like breath, like pulse, like the tapping of a pen against paper long after the hand has forgotten why. The refrain mutates but never concludes. Not compatible, not aligned, still processing, not allowed to end. Each phrase insists the same truth. The file continues. And here we pause, because in the pattern we recognize the system's comfort. To leave a man unclosed is not error. It is profit. Silence pays. Repetition soothes donors. Still processing calms oversight. The chant is not accident. It is design. This is the echo. Not the voice of myth, not the cry of witness, but the hum of procedure turning anomaly into routine. And once routine, it persists forever. A system does not confess. It does not blush. It does not tremble. It does not repent. It absorbs. It repeats. It holds anomalies until the anomaly itself forgets it was ever strange. By the time our man's file had passed through 3 clerks, 4 physicians, 2 attendants, and a matron who wrote against herself, the truth was no longer his. It belonged to the ward, the ledger, the institution. And that, perhaps, was the system's first trick, to convince everyone that the file itself was more real than the man who breathed inside it. The refrain had already told us what the system required. Not compatible, not aligned, still processing, not allowed to end. These were not observations. They were instructions, survival phrases that kept donors tranquil, city inspectors satisfied, and clerks safe. But why did the paper chant them? What incentive turned these scattered refusals into policy? The answer lies in what we might call backlog optics. Every annual report to the city presented columns of outcomes. Recovered, improved, unchanged, died. The categories never matched lived reality, but they always matched expectation. Too many in the first column, and the ward seemed unnecessary. Too many in the last, and the donors fled. The golden mean was stasis, a ward that looked busy, but not tragic, competent, but not miraculous, orderly without scandal. And so, any case that threatened that arithmetic was frozen. Our man, impossible, irreducible, destabilized the count. His continued presence was dangerous. But if you file him as still processing, you can keep the numbers in balance. A category, invented to soothe a report, becomes a cage that lasts longer than breath. Backlog optics alone might not have sufficed. But systems thrive on multiple redundancies, multiple shields. The second was donor tranquility. The newsletters sent to patrons were always written in the same register. Calm wards, compliant patients, clerks who never missed a line. The stories were carefully chosen. They reassured the public that their money purchased not chaos but order, not screams but serenity. A man with two faces could never appear in those columns. His presence would suggest disorder, error, or worse, that the ward did not know what it held. So he was filed out of existence, erased from every narrative that reached beyond the building's walls. Not aligned, not compatible. Better a lie than a ripple in a donor's glass of wine. The third mechanism was language itself. Listen to the words. Compatibility, alignment, processing. None of these are medical. They belong to engineering, to machinery, to the new world of industry that New York worshipped at the turn of the century. They are borrowed terms, chosen because they flatten. They take the unbearable and make it mechanical. Flesh is horrifying when it carries two faces. Paper is manageable when it carries still processing. These words are not description. They are anesthesia. And every repetition dulls the pain until clerks stop asking what they are. Hiding dot, we might imagine, if we are kind, that these were errors. That a clerk was careless, that a nurse was timid, that a surgeon was proud. But that is the smaller story. The larger story is design. The institution itself learned how to protect itself. When one witness contradicted, it buried the contradiction. When one photograph refused to age, it called it misaligned. When one nurse wrote he blinks in order, it filed her line but never circled it. Each denial was not random. It was strategy. The system made its own changeling. Not born, not buried, only filed. We see it in the artifacts that survive. A draft donor's report, never sent, carries a line that was crossed out before printing. One anomaly persists without diagnosis. The ink is thick where the pen struck, as though the hand feared even the draft might be seen. A board minute from October 1901 is redacted, its center line inked over until the fibers tear. Beneath the erasure, in raking light, you can still trace three words, not allowed to end. A furnace ledger, listing coal consumption by ward, includes one stray note beside Ward D. Bed 14 requires 2 trays. Coal meals beds, arithmetic. Repeats what medicine will not say dot, and through all of it, the man with 2 faces becomes less than a patient and more than a man. He becomes a setting. The system files him not as a person, but as a condition, permanent interim, unassigned, still processing. Language that places him between categories, where accountability cannot reach. This is the cruelest revelation, that the file draws the man, not the other way around. He cannot redraw the file. He cannot exist outside its margins. To the ward, he is not an anomaly in flesh, but an anomaly in paperwork, and the paperwork decides what survives. Folklore knew this shape long before bureaucracy did. The changeling who is left in a cradle not to live, but to distort the family that receives. It, the revenant who returns not to speak, but to burden the village with its unfinished presence. The automaton that repeats its gestures perfectly, never aging, never failing, rehearsing until the watchers grow numb. Our man is not myth, but the system that filed him behaved mythically, as though it had conjured its own protective double. A man neither alive nor dead, useful only because he allowed the paper to balance dot, and here is the thesis, sharpened from residue. A system that heals itself at the expense of people is not negligence. It is violence. A system that invents new words to disguise old erasures is not confusion. It is design. A system that files a man with two faces as still processing is not lost. It is perfectly found in its own survival. The villain, then, is not the physician who wrote growth, not the nurse who dared to write in order, not the matron who whispered it has learned my hours. The villain is the ledger that called all these things compatible and aligned and processing. The villain is the arithmetic that rewarded stillness and punished movement. The villain is the system that forgot how to forget. And so we name it plainly. This is not a ghost story. This is a system story. A story where profit replaces memory, where tranquility replaces witness, where silence replaces breath. A story where a file learned to be more real than the body it held. And in that silence, we hear it still. Don't close the file. Closure in a file like this is never true closure. It is residue layered on residue, as if each witness, each artifact, each phrase leaves behind a shadow that cannot be erased. The first residue comes from the fibers themselves. In the ward ledger, beneath the ink, 3 dents lie in sequence where no hand chose to write them. Kept, not kept, still recorded, pressure without ink, intention without courage. Someone pressed these words, abandoned them, but the paper never forgot. If you run a finger across the surface, you can feel the decision still lodged there, like a pulse under skin. The second residue is etched not in paper, but in wood. The drawer that held the photograph carries a shallow line carved from within, invisible until the steel track is lifted. 4 words in a hand too cramped for show. Don't close the file. Who carved it, we cannot know. A clerk weary of silence. A nurse unwilling to watch another year pass without record. Or perhaps no one at all, only the drawer itself remembering. The pressure of hands too often pulling, too often pushing, until memory became inscription. The third residue rests in image. The photograph, side by side with a modern control, still rehearses its impossible refusal. The control yellows, the control blurs, the control bows to time. The subject does not. Darkens, then clears, clouds, then lifts. As if the man's second face knew it had been denied everywhere else, and chose to remain, not in flesh, but in emulsion. Not in the ward, but in paper's afterlife. These residues, taken together, whisper what no official report dared. The file remains alive. But closure is not only artifact. It is parable. In folklore, the changeling is sometimes exposed by ritual. Place it on the hearth, they said, and it will speak or flee. But in this case, no ritual was performed. The institution preferred silence to revelation. So the changeling was never named, never burned away, never returned. It was left in the bed, left in the drawer, left in the photograph, still processing. The revenant, too, is meant to be laid to rest by confession, by recognition, by naming the wrong it carried. That never happened here. The second face was never named. The confession never came. The revenant remains, unfinished, unfinished, unfinished. And the automaton? It is built to rehearse forever. It blinks in order. It repeats sequences. It convinces its watchers that life continues while nothing changes. Our man became an automaton, not because he was machine, but because the file forced him into repetition. Each time the nurse wrote, he blinks in order. The file grew stronger. Each time the technician wrote image unchanged, the file rehearsed itself again. The parable is not about a man who bore 2 faces. It is about a system that bore 2 truths and chose the one that paid. One face told the truth. There was a body that did not conform. A other face told the donors. All is quiet, all is stable, all is aligned. And the institution turned toward the second face every time. So what was he? A man misplaced? A man invented? A patient who lived with a growth, or a clerk's error? Magnified, or a myth in flesh? The file does not answer. It cannot, because the file's survival depends on not ending. Perhaps that is why the last line of the last ward note does not end with a period. Temperature 98.1. Skin cold. Appetite reduced. And then nothing. No punctuation. No closure. Just a trailing line with a nib lifted, hesitant, uncertain. The file refused its own ending. We close then, not with certainty, but with instruction. Do not believe this is a ghost story. It is about a system that forgot how to forget. A system that taught its servants to chant silence until silence became fact. A system that filed a man twice, once with his name, once with his photograph, and then denied the second every time it spoke. Residue remains. The beneath fiber triplet. Kept, not kept, still recorded. The drawer etched line. Don't close the file. A photograph that returns to itself. The refrain that mutates but never dies. Not compatible, not aligned, still processing, not allowed to end. And now, the final ritual. If you are listening, tell me your country and the time. There is comfort in knowing we are scattered across the world, yet drawn into the same drawer, opening the same file, hearing the same silence. The file breathes. The drawer whispers. The image rehearses. Don't close the file. Closure, in a file like this, is never true closure. It is residue layered on residue, as if each witness, each artifact, each phrase leaves behind a shadow that cannot be erased. The first residue comes from the fibers themselves. In the ward ledger, beneath the ink, 3 dents lie in sequence, where no hand chose to write them. Kept, not kept. Still recorded. Pressure without ink, intention without courage. Someone pressed these words, abandoned them, but the paper never forgot. If you run a finger across the surface, you can feel the decision still lodged there, like a pulse under skin. The second residue is etched not in paper, but in wood. The drawer that held the photograph carries a shallow line carved from within, invisible until the steel track is lifted. 4 words in a hand too cramped for show. Don't close the file. Who carved it, we cannot know. A clerk weary of silence. A nurse unwilling to watch another year pass without record. Or perhaps no one at all, only the drawer itself remembering. The pressure of hands too often pulling, too often pushing, until memory became inscription. The third residue rests in image. The photograph, side by side with a modern control, still rehearses its impossible refusal. The control yellows, the control blurs, the control bows to time. The subject does not. Darkens, then clears, clouds, then lifts. As if the man's second face knew it had been denied everywhere else, and chose to remain, not in flesh, but in emulsion. Not in the ward, but in paper's afterlife. These residues, taken together, whisper what no official report dared. The file remains alive, but closure is not only artifact. It is parable. In folklore, the changeling is sometimes exposed by ritual. Place it on the hearth, they said, and it will speak or flee. But in this case, no ritual was performed. The institution preferred silence to revelation. So the changeling was never named, never burned away, never returned. It was left in the bed, left in the drawer, left in the photograph, still processing. The revenant, too, is meant to be laid to rest by confession, by recognition, by naming the wrong it carried. That never happened here. The second face was never named. The confession never came. The revenant remains unfinished, unfinished, unfinished. And the automaton? It is built to rehearse forever. It blinks in order. It repeats sequences. It convinces its watchers that life continues while nothing changes. Our man became an automaton not because he was machine, but because the file forced him into repetition. Each time the nurse wrote, he blinks in order. The file grew stronger. Each time the technician wrote image unchanged, the file rehearsed itself again. The parable is not about a man who bore two faces. It is about a system that bore two truths and chose the one that paid. One face told the truth. It was a body that did not conform. The other face told the donors, all is quiet, all is stable, all is aligned. And the institution turned toward the second face every time. So what was he? A man misplaced? A man invented? A patient who lived with a growth, or a clerk's error magnified, or a myth in flesh? The file does not answer. It cannot. Because the file's survival depends on not ending. Perhaps that is why the last line of the last ward note does not end with a period. Temperature 98.1. Skin cold. Appetite reduced. And then nothing. No punctuation, no closure. Just a trailing line where the nib lifted, hesitant, uncertain. The file refused its own ending. We close then, not with certainty, but with instruction. Do not believe this is a ghost story. It is about a system that forgot how to forget. A system that taught its servants to chant silence until silence became fact. A system that filed a man twice, once with his name, once with his photograph, and then denied the second every time it spoke. Residue remains. The beneath fiber triplet. Kept, not kept, still recorded. The drawer-etched line. Don't close. The file, the photograph that returns to itself. The refrain that mutates but never dies. Not compatible, not aligned, still processing. Not allowed to end. And now, the final ritual. If you are listening, tell me your country and the time. There is comfort in knowing we are scattered across the world, yet drawn into the same drawer, opening the same file, hearing the same silence. The file breathes. The drawer whispers. The image rehearses. Don't close the file.